Hello and welcome back. When we last left off in Chapter 9 of Cloak of Obscurity, Eddie and the rest of the city had just discovered that Lee was in fact a girl. Something which probably seems obvious to at least 50% of you. Eddie, bless his heart, for a fellow with second sight, he's awfully blind sometimes. So, to continue. You didn't know? Sadie was still asking. Very few people were leaving the hall during the recess, probably afraid they'd lose their places. I didn't know, I repeated, still somewhat dazed. How would I? I mean, Lee didn't tell me. But you're a wizard, she protested. I can't read people's minds without their permission, I said, and I certainly don't go asking my friends to take off their clothes. I had no reason to think Lee was a woman. Really, woman isn't quite the word for her. She's scarcely more than a child, and how did you know? Well, I could just tell, Sadie said. Not that I would have ever gone and said anything. I think Dolores knew, but she didn't say anything to me. I guess women can just see these things easier than men. Well then, I wonder how Malcolm found out, I said. From what Dolores told me, they slept in the same room, said Sadie. It was probably harder to him than from the rest of the world. I thought back over my several months' friendship with Lee, trying to think if there had been any clues I'd missed. Very few, I decided. She had always been unusually modest, but so had I been at that age. Realizing that my own behavior had often been something other than gentlemanly, I fought the urge to find a wall and beat my head against it. I realized this was really going to take some getting my head around, had said something a few days before about wanting to tell me everything. Well, if this wasn't everything, it was pretty damn close. When the trial resumed, I was called before the judges. Far sooner than I'd expected to be. I tried not to listen to the hisses and murmurs of the people I passed. Malcolm had done an excellent job of poisoning the crowd against me. I prayed that I could be a bit more even-handed in my speaking. Duke Cyprian eyed me critically, but not unkindly. I met his gaze as evenly as I could, without appearing forward. So, the nobleman said, you are the fellow we have heard so much about. What is your name? I call myself Edward Redmage, your grace, I said, but my father was Robert Weaver. There are a good number of Weavers in this city. Which one is your father? I smiled and answered as father's guildmates would have. The fat one, sir. Ah, the Duke laughed at this. I think I know the man. Black beard, loud voice. Yes, sir. The Duke nodded. Yes, I know him. He served in my army. Well, you must have been a boy then. He paused. Wait a moment. Are you the lad who... I knew what he was going to ask. Yes, sir, that was I. Well, I feel old now. You were knee-high to a red dog at the time. He called up to the king. Your Majesty, this great strapping youth here is the same little boy who... Yes, I know who he is, the king called back. May we proceed with the trial? Certainly, your Majesty. The Duke smiled at me. So, Edward, son of Robert, the fat weaver. Are you ready to take the oath? Yes, sir. I swore by God, Saint Dana, and all the angels to tell the truth as best as I was able. Then Master Arnold stepped forward and asked if he might be the one to question me. I suspected he believed that the Duke would show me favoritism. The Duke probably suspected it too, but was likely just as happy to get off his feet again. "How do you know these people, Red Mage?" was Arnold's first question. "I bought a pair of boots at their shop. And this was enough to involve you in their intimate affairs?" "I paid for the boots with a card reading for Master Roger," I said, "and naturally I learned a great deal about his household from that, but I wouldn't call myself involved in his affairs. I don't reveal what I learn in a reading." "Never?" Arnold said. I shrugged. "I wouldn't get much business if I did." A few listeners chuckled at that. "We have been told," Arnold continued, "that you were teaching the elf Lee to read. Why?" "Because Lee asked," I said simply. "My mother's uncle was a priest of St. Gabriel. My family believes reading is a spiritual necessity." "And did you know," he asked, "that Lee was a woman?" I glanced over at Lee, who was sitting next to Mother Lillian. She was staring at the floor. "No, I did not," I said. "I was as surprised as you to learn that today." "Now, how can that be?" Arnold demanded. "You are a wizard, with the power to read the future in a pack of cards. How could you not know you were being lied to?" I gave him the same answer I'd given Sadie. "I do not read people's minds, Master. Certainly not without their consent. If Lee had wanted me to know her true identity, she would have told me." Master Arnold snorted. "Well, can you please describe to the court, then, what your relationship was with this young person you believed to be a boy?" I didn't especially like the way he'd put that, but I answered politely. Lee would come visit me in the evenings after her work was done, and I would teach her to read and write, generally in the main room of the tavern where I live amongst a crowd of other people, I added, just to let people know I hadn't been used to spending time alone with her. "And that was how you became aware of the conflict in the Tanner household, by spending evenings with their servant?" "It wasn't something we discussed." "And why not?" Master Arnold went on like this for what seemed like a week. He kept poking and prodding, as if I had somehow had something to gain from butting into Allison's frustrated romance, and I kept trying to explain that I had thought the family's problems none of my business, until Lee was falsely accused. I really had very little to add to Lee and Malcolm's stories of what went on at the house, especially since I'd not been there. "Why were you following Malcolm the night Allison died?" Arnold finally asked me. "I wasn't following him," I said. "Then what were you doing in the tavern?" I answered honestly. "Asking directions, Master." "You were lost?" "I'd made a wrong turn somewhere." "You expect us to believe a wizard could get lost in his own city?" Arnold said, incredulous. "I'd been drinking," I admitted. "I'd been at a gathering at the home of one of my kinsmen, Thomas Dyer. When the party broke up, I offered to escort one of the guests home. And after that, I was in an unfamiliar part of town, and I got lost. I can produce witnesses to my story, if you like." "So what you are telling us," Master Arnold said, pacing back and forth, "is that you ended up in the same tavern as Malcolm, purely by chance?" "I didn't even know it was Malcolm who came up and hit me. It was so dark," I said. "I had no idea, in fact, until I saw him again 2 days later in the temple." "Yes, the temple." Arnold stood, fixing me with a pointed stare. "What exactly were you doing there? Malcolm has claimed you were, how did he put it, performing unnatural acts upon Allison's body?" The crowd grew very quiet indeed. all eager to hear what I had to say to this accusation. I refused to be baited, and answered calmly. I was examining Allison's body to see if I could determine the cause of her death, I said. I discovered that she had drowned. There was a piece of seaweed half swallowed in her mouth. The blow to her head probably came from being battered by waves against some rocks after she was dead. When Malcolm arrived, I continued, I was performing a spell which would allow me to see the final moments of Allison's life, as she saw them, in order to learn who it was who drowned her. Oh, really? Arnold Glacier said. And just what does this spell involve? Now I faltered. The last thing I wanted was to tell the whole city I had tried to pluck the eyes from a corpse. It would be the end of my career. Bless the saints, Mother Lillian rose to my rescue. Master Glacier, she said, as I said before, I was there on duty in the crypt that day. I know all about this spell. Malcolm forbade Master Edward from casting it when he arrived to arrange for a coffin for the girl's body. You were performing this spell without permission? Glacier asked me. Mother Lillian answered for me. Yes, she was, her tone firm enough to intimidate the king himself. And though his motive was purely to learn the truth about the girl's death, I could not allow him to continue when I learned he had no authority to do so. He has, in fact, been fined by the temple for this transgression and issued penance. That particular matter is closed. I will personally confirm as true all he has said about the body. Further, after learning that the girl had drowned, I consulted a priest of Marina regarding the tides the day of the girl's death. For her to have died the way she did, she would have had to have fallen from the cliffs of the Bell, north of the city, at high tide. At any other time, the water would have been so shallow there, she would have died in the fall and not swallowed any seaweed. In any other spot, there would have been no rocks to cause the blow to her head. Now, according to the priest, high tide that evening came an hour after sunset. Therefore, anyone who can produce witnesses to his or her whereabouts at that time cannot have killed the girl. The crowd began buzzing again. Mother Lillian waved her hand to try and silence it. Peace, good gentles. We still have much to learn here, she said, much more patiently than the Duke would have. She turned back to me. Master Red Mage, have you anything to add to what we have been told already? I certainly did, but I wanted to take great care in how I said it. I had no desire to appear as a guilty man trying to pass suspicion onto someone else. I was sure there were plenty of folks who believed a wizard could cause Allison to fall into the sea, no matter where he was at high tide. I was called on by Allison's betrothed, Dennis Cobbler, yesterday. He told me he saw Allison on the evening of her death, after she had fought with Malcolm. The crowd came to life again. Once Mother Lillian had quieted them, I continued. He told me he saw her near the north gate, heading towards it. Did he speak to her? Mother Lillian asked. Dennis said that he did, but I am certain he would rather tell his own story than have me do it if he's here. I agree, the priestess said. If the judges agree, we shall have this fellow, who seems to have no other faults than excessive curiosity and a fondness for drink, that got a chuckle from the crowd, sit down and ask young Dennis Cobbler to come forward, if he is present. He was, and he did, looking quite pale and unhappy, but holding his head high. He took the oath and told a story, to Master Arnold this time. Arnold seemed to take sadistic pleasure in exposing guild law infractions, in this case Dennis violating his guild-sanctioned betrothal. The crowd, too, was especially interested in the details of his love affair and secret marriage. Still, Dennis managed to keep his composure, possibly because he was too dim to realize just how bad his story sounded. "Wait a moment," Arnold said as Dennis recounted his final conversation with Allison. "You say she released you from your betrothal?" "Yes, master." "Was that before or after you told her about your lover?" Dennis flushed, but only slightly. "Melly is my wife, master. We are married, and Allison released me from our betrothal before I told her that we were." "Did she give you a reason?" "No, but I figured since her father was dead and couldn't stop her, she was releasing me so she could marry Malcolm." "Ah, but wait," Arnold said loudly. "Malcolm just told us she refused to break the engagement. So either one of you young men is lying, or she said one thing to one of you and another to the other. And what reason would she have for doing that?" "I don't know, master," Dennis said, looking quite bewildered. "It makes no sense to me," Arnold continued. "I can't believe she would reject both her suitors. It makes far more sense for her to reject the one and insist on marrying the other. After all, you stand to inherit your father's shop. Combined with the one she inherited from her father, that's a considerable amount of wealth." "But I told you," Dennis insisted. "She broke off our betrothal. She wasn't interested in the shop." "That's what you say," Master Arnold said. "I think she was, at the very least, in the sense of obeying her dead father's command to marry you and unite the two concerns. I think when you met Allison that day, you told her about your woman and the baby, and Allison told you to reject them and fulfill your vow to her." "That's not it at all," Dennis protested. "I told you what happened." "Why would I lie about it?" "Because you killed her." The crowd predictably broke into a roar at that, and it took quite a bit of shouting on the part of Duke Cyprian to quiet them down. "All right," the Duke bellowed. "That is quite enough. I will have order. I will have the court cleared." He turned to Arnold with obvious distaste. "Unlike you, master, I am not yet prepared to pass judgment. Let's let this fellow finish his story to start with. We have plenty more witnesses here today. I'm sure we'll come to the truth eventually." So Cyprian took over questioning Dennis, who was now visibly shaken and much less sure of himself. He finished his story, though, telling the court, as he had told me, how he had broken the news of his marriage to Allison and her odd response to the news. Then the Duke asked him to sit down, while he called out to see if anyone willing to testify for him were present. Dennis' wife and her mother were understandably at home with the infant, but Aunt Nan, the midwife, was there. Her story, not unexpectedly, tallied with Dennis. Once she sat down, the Duke called up a young man in the livery of the King's Guard, whom I had never seen before. After the guard had taken his oath, the Duke introduced him as the man who had been guarding the North Gate on the evening Allison had died. "You have been listening to everything that has been said here," the Duke said, "and know that we are concerned with a young girl who was supposedly last seen headed for the North Gate 6 days ago. Tell the court, if you can, if you saw a girl of about 17, alone or with someone, leave the city about sundown." I suspected that he had. Otherwise, why would Cyprian have brought him in? "Yes, your grace," he answered. "I saw a girl leave the city alone that night, just after sunset." "Did you happen to notice what she looked like, or how she dressed?" the Duke asked. "She had fair hair. It was uncovered. She wasn't too tall, and she had a nice shape to her, if you know what I mean. Not too fat, mind you, but she hadn't been starving, and I think her gown was blue." "Are you sure?" Cyprian asked. "I mean, did you get a good look at her? It was getting dark, after all." "Well, yes, sir, it was, but I looked fairly close at her, your grace," said the guard, "since I was curious about her. Young girls don't leave the city alone very often, and especially not that late in the day, and besides, she was a pretty one. Like I said, she had a good shape." Yes, you mentioned that," the Duke said. "Is there anything else you can tell us about her?" "Well, she was the only girl I saw leave the city alone that night, for one thing," he said. "For another, she was right upset about something. I could see in her face she'd been crying, and she was wringing her hands like, and sort of staring at the ground like no one else was there, though there were still plenty of people in the streets and on the bridge yet. Did you speak to her at all?" "No, your grace," the guard said. "I've seen a few girls in a state like that, rushing out over the bridge before now, and it's always that they're going to meet their young man with some bad news, like there's a baby coming, or her husband's found out, or something. Nothing a girl would want a stranger poking into." "Did you see her return to the city?" "No, your grace, and I was watching out for her. She didn't return to the city by the north gate that night. Now, she might have come back in the morning, or by the west or the south gates, but I wouldn't know. If she's the one is dead, it's a pity. She'd have made someone a fine wife. Like I tell you, she had a good..." Yes, she was a pretty girl," the Duke said. "Enough about her for the moment. You've been watching and listening to the other folk who have testified today, yes?" "Yes, sir, I have," the guard answered. "Do you recall seeing any of them leaving the city that night?" "No, sir, I don't, but, well, that doesn't mean they weren't there. I'm not as likely to notice a man as a girl." "Well, that one big red-haired fellow, the wizard, I might," he admitted, "as he does stand out a bit. But the rest of them, I wouldn't have noticed. Like that one elf, who's really a girl, well, I would never look twice at her. She's just like a boy, really, no shape at all. None of the elves do. Anyway, your grace, I really wouldn't have noticed the others, unless they did something odd." "Thank you," the Duke said. "That will be all." The guard from the north gate sat down. His testimony was followed by that of two more guards, one from the south gate and one from the west. Neither of them had seen either a girl matching Allison's description, nor any of the rest of us. When they were finished, Duke Cyprian addressed the king and populace. "Your Majesty, good folk," he began, "you recall what my fellow judge, Mother Lillian, said regarding the most likely time and place of the girl's death. Now, we have the testimony of the sentry on duty at the north gate that night, who saw a girl leaving the city and not returning. A girl who matched Allison's description, fair, comely, with hair unbound and wearing a blue dress. What we're not sure of is, was she followed, and if she was, by whom?" He paused to give his audience time to consider what he had said. "I have a few more people here today," he continued, "who are willing to testify as to the whereabouts of the elf and the other young men we have heard speak today. With your Majesty's indulgence, I would like to call them forward to speak briefly, beginning with the Lady Tila, chosen speaker for the elf nations." He may not have addressed her as queen, but the Duke was very polite to the old woman as she came forward and made her oath. She appeared to be wearing even more ornaments than on the day we had met, and her beaded gown was woven with gold and silver threads. "I, Tila Alapio, Queen of the Seven Clans, she said proudly, swear by my honor as born leader of my people, and by the treaties of peace and friendship which I have made with King Harold, that all I will say is true. The crowd murmured a bit at that. Duke Cyprian looked up at His Majesty. Craning my head back over my shoulder, I could see the king nodding. Your word is sufficient, the Duke said. You have come to speak for your subject? I have. Then where was Lee at high tide on St. Michael's Eve? On the eve of the solstice, Wehelilea was with the other elves who lived near this city, partaking in a ritual to honor our gods. I have spoken to over half a dozen of my people who remember seeing her. If you wish, I will call them forward to speak for her. Once more the Duke looked to the king, and once more His Majesty silently nodded. Then, and it was straining my neck to watch, I saw the king rise. I accept the testimony of the Lady Tila Halapio, he said, his deep voice booming out across the crowded hall. If my judges concur, I declare the elf Wehelilea to be innocent of murder. I gasped as Sadie grabbed me forcefully about the ribs. But I charge her to consult with the members of our guilds before she next decides to practice a craft in this city. I thought I caught the faintest hint of a smile in his eyes as he said that. The three judges whispered briefly to each other. I think Master Arnold might have tried to protest, but was talked down. Duke Cyprian turned to face the king. Your Majesty, he said, we concur. We find the elf to be innocent. Then she is free to go, the king said. Dolores, who'd apparently been seated a few rows ahead of us, pushed her way through the crowd to the scribe's ear, where the guards were trying to convince a rather dazed-looking Lee that she was finally free. The housekeeper threw her arms about the elf and began trying to shepherd her out of the court. This was rather difficult, for the assembled populace had decided, as a body, that there was nothing more to see and were all trying to leave. Hold, came the king's voice from the balcony. This matter is not yet closed. We still do not know who drowned the girl Allison. Your Grace, please see if we have witnesses to speak for the young men involved in this incident. As your Majesty wishes, the Duke said. The Duke first called Malcolm back before his bench and then asked if there were any witnesses for him. The tavern owner came up and testified that Malcolm had been there from sundown to the first bell. Obviously, the judges did not find him as unimpeachable a witness as the Elf Queen, because they then asked to hear from two of his servants, including the luscious barmaid, and three of the tavern's regular patrons. All of their stories tallied, and the court declared Malcolm innocent also. He left the bench, wearing his customary expression of sullen defiance. I was next. As I had hoped, Tom was there to back up my story, and politely told Duke Cyprian about my evening at his home, leaving out the more sordid details. Ranald was there as well, and spoke to much the same effect. Then a witness came forward that I would not have expected. My cousin Damien. His testimony was rather more detailed than my brothers-in-law had been, dwelling on the particulars of my inebriation and the exact time at which I had been seen leaving Tom's house with a scantily clad woman of relatively affordable virtue. I was mortified. However, I was also found to be innocent of any involvement in Allison's death. I was allowed to return, chastened and red-faced, to my seat. So, Sadie smirked, elbowing me sharply in the ribs. What's this girl's name? Are you going to see her again? I blushed furiously and said nothing. The last suspect to be returned to the bench was Dennis. He did not fare as well as we did. He had only one person present to speak for him, Mellie's Aunt Nan, and her testimony was far from reassuring. You have told us already, Master Arnold said, that Dennis was out of the house for quite a length of time the night of the murder. The glassblower had resumed the questioning, presumably so Duke Cyprian, who was starting to look exhausted, could take his considerable weight off his feet again. Mother Lillian, it seemed, preferred to listen quietly. Dennis went to buy salt, the midwife said, and came back to the house with it. How long was he gone? Arnold asked. I don't know, the woman said. You don't know? He repeated. Can you give us a guess? She shook her head. An hour? Maybe 2. 2 hours, Arnold was incredulous. 2 hours to buy salt? It was getting dark out, the woman countered. He said it took him a while to find an apothecary whose shop was open. Oh, he did he? Master Arnold turned to face the populace. Your Majesty, good gentles, Dennis Cobbler himself admitted that he saw Allison Tanner alive just after sunset, just as the tide was turning. He added, now we have the sworn word of his own kinswoman who says he was out of their home that evening for as long as 2 hours, surely long enough for him to have met Allison, led her out of the city, cast her into the sea, and then returned to Bell Camp, bought his salt, and returned home. I protest, cried a man's voice. It was Dennis' father, forcing his way past the guards to the bench. Dennis looked at him pleadingly. And who are you? Arnold asked, though I'm sure he knew. Master Wilbur Cobbler, he said. Dennis is my son. There is no way he could have murdered Allison. It's not in his nature. Are you sure? Arnold said. Are you certain? How well do you know your son, Master Wilbur? Did you know where he was the night Allison died? Master Wilbur said nothing. Did you even know he was married? That he was going to be a father? Again the old man was silent. Your Majesty, Arnold continued, I believe there is sufficient doubt as to young Dennis' whereabouts at the time of Allison's death, and sufficient cause for him to have taken her life, that I propose we hold him in Bell Camp Prison until enough witnesses can be gathered for a new trial. If your Majesty and my fellow judges concur, of course. I looked back at the king. He was looking at Duke Cyprian. Your Grace, the king asked, do you agree with Master Arnold? The Duke's fat face was grim. He nodded. And you, Mother Lillian, the king said, do you agree with your fellows? Her withered features were drawn and concerned. She sighed, but nodded as well. Then let it be so, the king said. Guards, take Dennis Cobbler to prison. Until such time as I call my next court, I am finished here. With that, the city guard dragged a protesting Dennis from the court, followed by his also protesting relations. The Ferrety Herald came forward again and attempted to announce, Here ends the court of his dread, but no one heard him, as everyone was surging for the exits. Well, Sadie said, I am glad that's over.